Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. Here with PBS NewsHour's senior foreign affairs producer on our planet. Huge and yet so small, so interconnected, versus the worst pandemic in a century. Stay with us. This show airs on NPR member station VPM News, using the power of media to educate, entertain, and inspire. Subscribe at link fulldradio.com. Joining me from Arlington, Virginia is Morgan Till, senior producer for foreign affairs and defense at the PBS NewsHour. This is a position he's been in since late 2015. Morgan has reported all across the globe: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Lebanon, Brazil, South Korea, reporting on war, revolution, natural disasters, and overseas politics. Sir, how are you considering?
I'm doing quite well, Robin. Thank you for having me on the program.
Well, thank you for coming on in a snap. Before all else, I want to know how you get your head around something like this. It seems like a few weeks ago, it feels like we were doing New Year's resolutions and planning the year ahead. Mm-hmm. And one moment, we're taking out the military leader of Iran, and they're talking about a broader war in the Middle East and World War III, and that is completely forgotten now that this pandemic, this once-in-a-100-year pandemic, has truly brought the world to its knees.
Yeah, I was, as we all are, scrolling through Twitter the other day, and our NPR colleague Steve Inskeep was charting that course from the beginning of the year with the killing of Qasem Soleimani and on, and threats of war and impeachment and everything. And I just tweeted back at him, I'd like a do-over. It's been that kind of year so far. And now I think there's the realization, especially over the last 10 days or so, and in the last couple of days, as the horrific death count spikes here in the United States, that this may be the biggest story of our lifetime. A lot of us covered September 11th. A lot of us have covered the wars since then, which were globe shifting and globe tilting. But this has a different feel. I mean, as we speak, there are 10 million Americans who have applied for unemployment insurance benefits in the last 10 days. That's just a shocking number that didn't happen during the Great Depression. We're looking at a period where instability in this country is just going to be widespread, economic instability, I should say. And then looking at the global picture, the Secretary General of the United Nations said the other day that he thinks it will take 1/10 of global GDP to get the globe back on track, which is an astonishing number. The United States has already passed a $2 trillion relief package. It's not really a bailout. It's a relief package and direct cash infusion. The Fed has opened every spigot it has. And we're looking at, the optimistic scenarios are that we're looking at June before people are really starting to get out and about again.
Is there something approximating a chief global health officer that every country or most of the countries it respects? The hermit kingdoms, the rogue states, the Western democracies.
It's a complex question and a complicated question. I mean, obviously, there is the World Health Organization and its Director General, its Secretary General, but the WHO itself, which was accused, at least by the United States and some others, of delaying declaration of the coronavirus epidemic and then pandemic. Some critics accuse it of knuckling under the pressure from the Chinese. There are guidelines that they put out. They do declare pandemics. They have declared this a pandemic. It's a complicated question because there's so many disparate interests for different countries. For all intents and purposes, the chief medical officer of the United States is not the Surgeon General right now. It's Tony Fauci, whom people have invested an enormous amount of faith and trust in. To guide America through this, separate and apart from the president's leadership on this. But in terms of the globe, it's kind of a mixed bag because, and it starts with the how the Chinese handled this in the late months of 2019, and how the WHO has handled it through the first part of 2020, and has been accused of just being a laggard on the subject in some respects.
Morgan, I'm looking at the Wall Street Journal, and there's a headline that Italy, which is one of the three or four huge ground zeros in this entire global pandemic. It's suggesting that Italy's coronavirus death toll is far higher than reported. We are now looking at Italy's official death toll from the virus stands at just over 13,000, the most of any country in the world. In the areas worst hit by the pandemic, though, Italy, the Wall Street Journal says, is undercounting thousands of deaths caused by the virus, indicating that the pandemic's human toll may end up being much greater and infections far more widespread than official data indicate. So can you walk me through this? Obviously, disproportionate amount of attention given to Hubei province in China and that wet market and the shutdown of Wuhan. But how in the world did it then emanate to northern Italy and then, say, the religious epicenter of Iran? How do you get your head around that?
So I'll start with anecdote from a very, very close friend of mine who runs an emergency room here in the D.C. area, who has been a physician for 20 years and has seen it all from, extraordinary violence when he was a resident in Baltimore to, suburban America to everything in between. And one thing that he told me really stuck with me, which is he believes, and a lot of the physicians he works with and nurses believe, that the coronavirus in some form or another has been here for several months prior to our recognition of it. Now, I don't know that there's data backing that up, but it was an interesting supposition because his hospital has been filled with flu patients up until a few weeks ago. He said it was the worst flu season he had seen on record, at least in his experience. And a good number of the people who were in there for the, quote, flu were not testing positive for the flu. So I think there is every reason to believe in some respects that the disease was on the move beforehand, before it was really recognized in the United States and by the WHO as a global threat. Be that as it may, this is a token of globalization. Hubei province, Wuhan, the city of Wuhan, many people had never heard of before the middle of January, is a city of 11 million people. It would be, the third largest city in the United States? Wow. There's enormous, third or fourth. There's an enormous amount of travel, in and out trade, travel, tourism. The interconnectedness of the planet is part and parcel of both our economic growth globally since World War II, but it's also, in this day and age, a thing that can seed disaster in some respects by virtue of the fact that people travel so often. There's so much global trade. One interesting thing, I was talking to one of my correspondents, Jane Ferguson, who's based in Beirut, wonderful reporter there. There was great concern when it was exploding in Iran that Shia pilgrims were coming back to Lebanon from Iran and bringing the virus with them, likewise to Syria. And then when you confront the great inequities in global public health systems, Italy has a very good healthcare system, and it's near the breaking point or has broken or is buckling. The United States contends that it has the greatest healthcare on the planet, and we're seeing nurses and doctors having their own scrubs and masks sewn for them by relatives or companies. There's no accounting for the fact that you need to prepare for these kinds of things in a way that is somewhat foreign to our notions of how you prepare for war or economic calamity or that kind of thing. And the speed with which it has done this. If you remember back, you're a financial reporter, you remember 2008, it started with Bear Stearns in February or March, and then things sort of cascaded over the months. This happened in a matter of days. And I don't think anyone, really since the onset of World War II has seen such a globe tilting and globe mangling event occur with such rapidity.
Well, everybody keeps pointing back to the great Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. There were not direct flights from various megacities on the coast of China to, you talk about Iran. I mean, in Tehran, there's been a tremendous influx, as in many cities in sub-Saharan Africa, of Chinese workers coming in to build out railroads and subway tunnels and the like. It's so hard to connect the dots on this in something that the paradox being that China in 2020 is the ultimate command and control, centrally planned state. And when something like this happened, they didn't waste any time in locking down Wuhan. And taking it to the kind of the nth degree of draconian measures. And at the same time, 2-3 months after that first started, they're being criticized for undercounting the numbers and not being as transparent maybe as they should have been with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's been very stark criticism, not only from the United States, but from others about how the Chinese reacted. The New York Times and others have reported out some very good stories about the internal dissension in both the dissension within the ranks, such as the blame shifting from the top down to the local officials who sort of are too scared of their own shadows to take executive and rapid action without the say-so of the central government, but also the delays in revealing that this pandemic or this epidemic was beginning in Wuhan. The United States, according to Bloomberg intelligence assessments from Wednesday, the 1st of April, said, the U.S. intelligence community assesses that they vastly undercounted both the number of dead and the number of infected. At this point, the United States has greatly surpassed them in both. And, China is a country that is almost 4 times the size of the United States. There's a lot of sort of reckoning about how countries have dealt with these issues, and especially China. There was something of a kind of a soft détente, you want to say, in the last couple of days of the war of words, but it began again on Thursday when the Chinese Foreign Ministry went after the United States again, saying the U.S. can't get its act together. Why are they accusing us essentially of undercounting when we've been very transparent? And obviously, the notion of transparency and the Chinese Communist Party do not go hand in hand. But be that as it may, you have kind of a dual set of messages here. The president last week calling it the Chinese virus, his top lieutenants, including the Secretary of State, referring it to as the Wuhan virus. I won't get into the arguments surrounding that, but there was a very conscious decision to accuse the Chinese of essentially loosing this on the planet without proper recognition of how to handle it. That softened somewhat. Now you see major shipments of aid coming from China to the U.S. The Chinese have also been called on the carpet for sending aid that doesn't work, testing kits that don't work to Western Europe and other places that have been faulty, which is, almost worse than sending nothing at all.
Morgan, couldn't they have gotten much more religion? I mean, SARS, the worst of the outbreak was in 2003. And while it was certainly scary at the time, it seems de minimis or penny ante in comparison. Why didn't China crack down on wet markets and the trade of things like pangolins or bush meat? Again, this goes back to the paradox of it being the ultimate surveillance state, the ultimate command and control economy. But this is something that they just let several times. You saw the swine flu, various other seasonal flus. There was a big culling of the pig population several years ago. It seems like they had many warnings.
They have, but there are a couple things at play. If you look off the coast of China, across the Taiwan Strait to Taipei, they got religion, and I'll come back to China in a second, but as we reported on the NewsHour on Wednesday, a really elaborately interesting piece reported by my colleague Nick Schifrin and Dan Segalin. After SARS, the Taiwanese took it to heart that they would never get flat-footed again, and the numbers during SARS is they had a substantial number of cases, several hundred on the order, and a substantial number of deaths because SARS was quite a deadly outbreak. It goes to the virtue of having a smaller, more controlled place. Taiwan is a democracy and has gone through some struggles of its own on that score, but they were able to regiment a complete top-down, all-of-government effort to essentially have a la carte testing, treatment, tracking regimen in a box. I don't get the notion that the Chinese have had the same thing. There were, the head of China's CDC and others have. There was some reporting last week that they had also done, much like the United States, some wargaming on this. Essentially, some tabletop exercises, worst case scenarios, and that those warnings weren't heeded, much as they were with exercises done in the United States that had been done, starting, in earnest after September 11th, when there was great fear, if you recall, to the anthrax attacks about some kind of bioweapon attack on the United States. Those efforts have waxed and waned through the years. But, the question about China's readiness for something like this, there's a great phrase that everyone's always fighting the last war. United States decided to ramp up its airline security after planes crashed in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. China may be looking down the road, and we ourselves here in the United States may be looking down the road at, okay, now we have to take this as a real threat. How do you build up this kind of capacity? Now, the Chinese, as you say, have a different mechanism wherein they can just go into a town in a city of 11 million people and shut it down and find people and, frankly, disappear people who break that curfew and that diktat. The United States, as an open society, that's harder to do. So there are a lot of questions coming out of this, down the road. You're already seeing some evaluative efforts being launched of how do you stop these things in an interconnected globe when there's so many disparate government systems and regimes across the planet. How do you get all on the same page? It's a question that greatly predates this, but now in this era, where a virus to which no one has immunity can just spread across the planet within the space of a couple of months, it's a question that everyone's going to have to engage with pretty soon.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You're listening to Morgan Till. He's senior producer for Foreign Affairs and Defense at the PBS NewsHour. Morgan, I want to get to Iran. That's where I was born. And this has been a special a hellish season, a hellish beginning of the year. And this is the Persian New Year kind of drawing to a close for Iran. Not only are they coming off of last year's much more mundane sanctions tightening, hyperinflation, lack of access to certain goods, thriving overpriced black market economy. But this year starts with Qom and other cities in Iran becoming one of the global epicenters of this pandemic. I mean, it was racing out of control. And at the same time, and we're going to unpack this story as well, Saudi Arabia and Russia are engaged in a crude oil price war, and it tanks the main source of revenue for the Iranian economy. So it's like they're taking a triple punch.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what the United States so-called maximum pressure campaign has done since the Trump administration took over, the components of which are chiefly, removing the United States from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and tightening the screws on every sort of sanction possible, reducing Iran's daily oil output below 1 million barrels a day, just absolutely crushing their economy. There is, sanctions on, there are almost weekly announcements from the Treasury and State Departments of new sanctions on different Iranian entities or persons. Then you confront both what happened on January 3rd with the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which, sent a shudder through the region, and frankly, globally with, oh God, what's going to happen now? These sort of low intensity back and forth between the United States and Iraq, in Iraq, I should say, not in Iraq, but between the United States and Iran in Iraq, with missile strikes and such. And then you get inside Iran, where we actually have a wonderful correspondent based in Tehran named Reza Sayah, who has done several pieces for us about the impact of coronavirus there. When you have people in the top rungs of the Iranian power structure, outside the theocracy, but Ali Larijani, the parliament speaker, a very well-known and very powerful man in the Iranian government, he's tested positive. There have been several top officials who've died, officials who were part of the cadre that took the hostages in Tehran in 1979 who have died. The reliability of the numbers of dead in Iran are also in question. There were some reports of some modeling showing several weeks ago that there could be 1 million dead in Iran. Those
Wow.
models are quite eye-popping, but by any stretch of the imagination, they are already having a terrible time under these sanctions. And the other component of that is, well, the United States says, we don't sanction anything that gets humanitarian aid in there. There's quite a debate over how that is. The Europeans, who've also been looking for a way around the American sanctions and set up their own mechanism last year to do that, have been trying to ship humanitarian aid to Tehran. But the upshot is that, it's shaken the government there. But in 40 years, you've seen, in the in the last 10 years, you've seen more challenges to the government there than you had in the previous 30 with, the Green Revolution, the uprisings of late 2017, which were very widespread. And now you have yet another challenge, invisible challenge to the regime happening in this time where the United States has put every screw it can, short of overt military action in the country, to the Iranian regime.
Crude oil is trading around $20, $25 a barrel, $30 a barrel at some points. But Iran's fiscal break-even price for them just to pay the bills and pay the various constituents of the Islamic Republic and whatnot is multiples of that. Indeed, you have Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, today calling for sanctions relief for Iran during the coronavirus pandemic. He specifically called for, quote, issuing broad licenses to pharmaceutical and medical device companies, easing the path for international banks, transportation companies, and insurers to provide medical treatment, and issuing new sanctions guidance to those groups and international aid organizations regarding how they can combat COVID-19 in Iran. Let's get to that oil price collapse, which is a kind of a parallel financial crisis. This starts many weeks ago. I mean, this is something that nobody saw. I guess it kind of gets to the true Machiavellian nature of Mohammed bin Salman, the young controversial leader of Saudi Arabia, that when he got the first indications that this was truly a pandemic, and there's this disagreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia of how much output should be cut in a slowing economy, that the first reaction from Mohammed bin Salman when you're looking at a demand collapse is to flood the global market with Saudi oil, which is the cheapest on the planet to produce, presumably to snuff out the U.S. shale oil producers and Canada.
Yeah, I mean, and you saw an absolute panic among those shale producers in the United States and in Canada who, as you know, shale and tar sands are much greater processing intensive efforts to extract oil. The United States is now the largest net exporter on the planet, but that sent a shudder through those markets. And you had actually in the same vein, Russia, the Russian economy depends enormously on its fossil fuel exports, gas predominantly, but also enormous amounts of oil, which have been sanctioned in some part by the United States for its interference in the 2016 election. But you saw this drive, a real kind of showdown between Mohammed bin Salman and Vladimir Putin, and many of Vladimir Putin's longtime lieutenants, one of his top lieutenants, Igor Sechin, who runs the Rosneft conglomerate in Russia, must have been, as they say in Brooklyn, plotzing. And now you had in the wake of that decision, which drove gas prices through the floor, the president tweeting at that point, I think it was about 3.5 weeks ago, this is great for American consumers. Cheap gas is always good for American consumers, to the point where, that I have a big horse farm near Charlottesville, Virginia, and my mother, who was out just to get gas, and something the other day said in Charlottesville, the gas at Costco earlier this week on Tuesday, was $1.35 a gallon, which is shocking. And if you remember before the financial crash in the summer of 2008, gas was up near $4 a gallon in a large swath of the country. And now what you see is as we record this on Thursday, the president's tweet that he had spoken with his, quote, friend, Mohammed bin Salman. Remember that this, quote, friend is largely assessed to have ordered the murdering and dismemberment of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 at the consulate in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. But he said he spoke to his friend MBS, and they would come to some kind of deal with the Russians to limit output to try to raise prices. Now, there were some West Texas producers who saw their stock and the commodities trade rocket up 30% after that. And then the Russians subsequently, in not too long after, denied that a call between Putin and MBS had even happened. So it's a bit opaque as to what's happened between them. It has served today, Thursday, at least to bolster some commodities prices. But where we go from here, it's with the demand having fallen through the floor, with people not driving, airlines not flying, if you look on any traffic map of any city in the United States, I mean, you could drive 125 miles an hour on the Washington Beltway and not see another car. It's that kind of demand crash, and limiting the supply would seem to make sense in theoretically, but we don't know where we're going from here.
Time was, Morgan, that OPEC, largely controlled by the likes of Saudi Arabia, which was the producer of lowest cost. I hear somewhere $3 to $5 a barrel to extract it from the ground. But then you had big players such as Nigeria, Iran. Iran could hold the United States over a barrel, if you would, in 2006 and 2007. And some of these concerns led to $140 crude by 2008. But then we saw a revolution happen in the United States, the shale oil patch revolution, the Bakken patch. I remember a Bloomberg headline in 2012, North Dakota's oil production, which had surged to a certain level in 2011, had already exceeded the output of OPEC member Ecuador. So you fast forward this 8 years, and I don't recall any period of OPEC looking so diminished and so kind of out of order. Time was that high oil prices were good for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back to that era there, and you saw as many pieces as I did of about the roughnecks out on the patches in South Dakota, and all these guys rolling up in their pickup trucks like mine and pulling down $150 or $200 or $250,000 a year by working incredible hours and overtime, and they set up these.
McDonald's in North Dakotas were offering $18 an hour.
Yeah, I mean, it was literally the gold rush redux from the 1840s, where there's gold in them thar hills, where there's black gold in them thar hills. I mean, it's you had just the resurgence of the American oil industry, which had been crushed in the 70s, and as with OPEC, which was so strong then, and you had the embargo, et cetera, it was a policy of the Obama administration to really boost that, and the Bush administration before them, given obviously the top two men in the Bush administration and their history in the oil business. But it is amazing that has come to where we are now, which is the United States, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest net exporter of oil and fossil fuels on the planet. But you have a situation where the prices, as you rightly mentioned in 2008 in the summer, where oil was at just a shockingly high price, $130, $140 a barrel. It's, it's a fifth of that now, if that. And that has left, a lot of workers out of work out there. If you read the great reporter and writer Charlie LaDuff, his book about, which I won't utter the name of on public radio, but it's a rather evocative title that's called Blank Show. And he spent a lot of time out there talking to these guys at the height of this thing. And then sort of on the backside of this is when it all comes crashing down.
Can you help me get in the head of Mohammed bin Salman? I'm thinking back to the Khashoggi murder in Turkey, and has to have been the most expensive hit in history. If you do believe, as United States and Western intelligence has suggested, that he had to have had his thumbprints on this awful murder and dismemberment with a hit team in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, there's so much downside to that. If you look at Saudi Aramco's IPO, if you look at him being kind of regaled and treated to tours of New York and Silicon Valley behind that, and venture capital firms are looking to get the kingdom's money, and then next thing you know, he's a pariah.
Yeah, I far be it from me to get inside his head. I don't like to try to do that. We report. I'm trying not to be a psychoanalyst, but be that as it may, I think part of him thought it wouldn't matter. I think part of him thought no one would notice. There's an outstanding new book out by Ben Hubbard in the New York Times entitled MBS, which is a hell of a read. This is a young man. Don't forget, he is not. He's only in his early 30s. He is one of the most powerful people on the planet. He's one of the richest people, if not the richest person on the planet, outside of Vladimir Putin, who has enormous power and a complete and utter autocracy at his fingertips. His father is unwell. His father's in his mid-80s. There are episodic rumors, you see them as I do, that the king has died. MBS is in control. He's the crown prince. He's the defense minister. He's prosecuted a really somewhat disastrous war in Yemen, to the extent that his chief ally there, the UAE, Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, has pulled his troops out of there. I think in the final analysis, I thought, he thought he could get rid of a critic. He has thin skin, and that no one would really make that big a fuss about it. Where the rubber hit the road was, the Trump administration, the Secretary of State, Mr. Trump himself, other members of the high command were, giving them somewhat of the benefit of the doubt. Look, this is bad. It's really bad, but the Saudis are our allies. You saw a revolution on Capitol Hill, led by one of the president's top allies up there, Lindsey Graham, who drove very hard to sanction the Saudis. There was bipartisan denunciations of the Saudis. That led to denunciations of the war in Yemen, which has killed, by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of people by virtue of both violence and the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, with children starving in the streets. Jane Ferguson, whom I mentioned before, has done astonishing and multi-award-winning reporting from the country, which is not easy to get into and extraordinarily dangerous. But it's, you've seen over the last 18 months since Jamal was killed, a real kind of comeuppance for MBS in some ways, almost entirely of his own doing. You hear about the virtues of youth. You also hear about the rashness of youth. They've been in confrontation with Iran as well. That's a very stark confrontation.
What underpins that? It's the struggle, the battle for the soul of Islam. The seed of Shiite Islam and Sunni Islam.
I mean, I think at its core, yes. I'm not an expert on Iran or Saudi, but that goes to its core. They are both theocratic governments. MBS has tried at turns to quote liberalize Saudi Arabia, whether it's the baby steps towards allowing women to drive, allowing women in public cinemas and public sports stadiums, those kinds of things. His great plan, his Vision 2030 plan, which is, quite forward-looking in that it sees that, the gold between, the energy beneath the ground is finite and the energy from the sun is limitless, at least for the next few billion years, trying to wean Saudi off of a, one commodity economy. They don't produce anything else. They don't do anything else. But yeah, I mean, there is a significant aspect of this, which is a Sunni versus Shia issue. I mean, there's a large Shia population in the eastern sections of Saudi near their most productive oil fields. There was a huge contretemps a few years ago when the Saudi government executed a top Shia cleric there, which enraged the Iranians. It's a rivalry that has largely begun to govern the entire Middle East.
What happens, do you think, in your mind, if you play this out to these oil-beholden totalitarian states, if the price keeps collapsing, if you start to see single-digit oil sustainably, if this is a true depression? Have you kind of worked it out in your mind? I mean, Saudi Arabia can certainly take the hit. It's banked a lot of money, and it's very cheap to take it out of the ground. But how does an Iran deal with kind of chronically $10, $15 oil? How does a Nigeria? How does an Indonesia? How does a Venezuela, which is already nearing kind of failed state status?
Well, taking them in reverse order, Venezuela is, as you say, has the largest proven reserves on the planet. It is a beyond horrific disaster, and God forbid COVID-19 goes widespread there, because their healthcare system One of my colleagues, Marcia Biggs, was there right after the first of the year and did a very affecting series of reports out of Venezuela with a very talented producer at the NewsHour called Frank Carlson, about the just catastrophic conditions for healthcare there. You know, you're losing an entire generation of children either to malnutrition, stunted growth. They don't go to school. And then you pile on top of that the fact that 15 years ago when Hugo Chavez instituted Chavismo, which was essentially nationalizing the oil industry and taking these vast profits and pumping them into social welfare programs, their oil industry is now under such enormous sanction. Their only real clients are the Chinese and the Russians. And they're in such hock to them that they're just basically trading, oil for cash or oil for, satisfying their debts on the back of sending the Russians and Chinese oil.
It's compounded by the fact that oil from the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela is some of the lowest quality, heaviest crude that right now, especially in this market when there's such an abundance of it, you want the easiest, sweetest kind of extra virgin olive oil version of it. And this stuff is practically, it's being given away. They're paying certain people to take it.
Their infrastructure is in such abominable shape. If you go out to one of the main producing regions in Maracaibo in western Venezuela, Lake Maracaibo might as well be an oil slick. I mean, you put your hands in the water and just come up with globs of heavy crude. And then when some of the other countries you mentioned,
Take them to Iran. Iran, when you saw oil prices collapse in the late 90s, the students had their uprising. What was it in 1999? You saw the Green Movement in 2009. Correlation is not causation, but it's much harder for the government to keep control and to have bank behind the subsidies if oil is in free fall.
Of course. I mean, then the one country you didn't mention that I was actually going to throw in there is Iraq. Iraq is, almost entirely dependent on its oil exports through the port of Basra. If you go to the city of Kirkuk, which is often sort of now cliche, in a fit of cliche in journalism called oil rich, the oil infrastructure in Kirkuk is not in very good shape, and it's been so manipulated over the years that the oil there, which is the largest fields in Iraq, is of very poor quality now, and it takes a lot of processing. But the Iraqis, who have been, they finally reached a deal with the Kurds several years ago, and I've been to those Kurdish oil fields on 130-degree days. There was a deal finally reached because the central government was not sending any of the money that the Kurds were producing through their national oil sales back to the Kurds. And the Kurds had cut side deals with the Turks, which is somewhat counterintuitive, but they had a very, very lucrative pipeline deal going with the Turks. And then when you move east to Iran, as we discussed earlier, COVID-19 has forced everyone inside, which, with the cascading oil prices going down and everything, is probably, in the eyes of the regime, a benefit that they are not allowed out on the streets, because there would be another, you could certainly forecast another uprising of some kind there. They put it down very brutally when there was an uprising last year. And went back to the playbook that they used in 2009 and killed many more people by some analyses. But the people of Iran have suffered such an enormous amount through these years that if you look at the government's bottom line being knocked down another 25 or 30%, in addition to all of its other economic activity, both black and gray market that it does, you see, not failed state there because the state is quite strong, but calamity.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You're listening to Morgan Till, senior producer for foreign affairs at PBS NewsHour. Morgan, I am interested, and I'm very worried, frankly, and a lot of people, not just in the mercenary world of Wall Street, but NGO people are terrified of the second and third order effects of this jumping to very poor developing markets. You think about India, you think about Nigeria, if you've been to Lagos or the Niger Delta, where there's absolutely no infrastructure, no ability, nothing that can kind of keep this in check. I wonder what's going on in India right now, which has kind of been politically volatile unto itself. You have this order for people to stay inside, but it's such a populous country. It's so unwieldy control. There's so many people, so many different constituencies there that you really can't get your head around this idea of keeping a country that big and unwieldy under quarantine.
Well, and also one that's so underdeveloped. If you look every year, the UN does World Toilet Day to spotlight the fact that hundreds of millions of people on the planet, if not billions, don't have access to routine hygiene and sanitation. And the belts in Uttar Pradesh and other parts of India are just shocking, where people have no access, not only not to fresh water, but no routine sewer systems or hygiene of any kind. Then you put this, the great crowding of the country. And when Prime Minister Modi last week put down this diktat that everyone would stay inside for several weeks, it left a lot of internally migrant workers out holding the bag. I mean, you saw these heartbreaking stories of men saying, I've got to walk 400 miles home because they didn't get the last train. Separate and apart from the fact that you look at the train stations before this order and, it looks like Times Square on New Year's Eve, the most unhealthy and unsafe packing of people trying to get on trains to go home. It boggles the mind when a country that is, separate from its economic power, which it is an economic power, but it is still a vastly underdeveloped country without anything approximating the health system to handle something like this. I was talking to one of my colleagues in Bangladesh. Also, there is terror in the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, where there, I think, almost 1 million or over 1 million Rohingya Muslims who've fled Myanmar. These are people who are living in tents under tarps, in makeshift shanties. Also, no routine hygiene, no routine sewer systems, no routine fresh water. The nightmare scenario, which we've covered several times on the NewsHour already, and we'll go back to, is what happens when this gets into these really struggling refugee populations that are already underfunded. If you look at whether it's Myanmar, whether it's Bangladesh or Myanmar, or
the Congo, sub-Saharan Africa.
I mean, DRC will, I'm reliably told that on April 12th, DRC will declare its Ebola emergency over, but now it has COVID, and that is one of the nastiest wars on the planet, and is a multi-sided, brutal conflict in a country that's, just an enormous, intractable place. When you get into these countries that are so underfunded and so under-resourced, this will go like wildfire. I mean, if this is bending the United States in some respects, its largest city, to a breaking point, God forbid it's in Kinshasa or Lagos or in the refugee camps of northwestern Syria or in Turkey.
Even in South Africa, where you have many people from Zim in Johannesburg living in these big shanty towns.
And Zimbabwe has closed their borders in an effort to we have a piece upcoming on the NewsHour about how Uganda is handling this, since they have such enormous experience dealing with Ebola and Marburg and so many viral outbreaks through the years, how they're preparing to deal with that there with still a developing country, but one with a lot of experience dealing with these kinds of outbreaks.
One of the themes that you're hitting on is how, whether you look at Brazil or you look at the Philippines or Hungary, which right now is under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, you've heard rumors that maybe it should be booted from the European Union, that strong men are using this as an excuse to consolidate power. What do you make of that? That this is, I'm thinking back to Lincoln suspending the writ of habeas corpus in an emergency during the Civil War, but others are using this to throw people in jail on trumped up charges of endangering the public, even though they're political opponents. We've had Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. He's been kind of flamboyant on TV. He's downplayed the infectiousness of the virus. He went on TV to tell Brazilians that quarantine measures were absurd. What do you make of all that?
Before this outbreak, there was this sort of notion of the age of the authoritarian, whether it's Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, people with more authoritarian inclinations like Viktor Orban, like Jair Bolsonaro, people with great populist bases who had come to the fore at a particularly delicate moment. starting with Orban, I mean, he has made many anti-democratic moves over the last several years.
So this is Hungary. This is a European Union member. This is a stalwart, came out of the Iron Curtain in the late 80s, and it's been taken for granted, for 30 years?
Yes, I mean, it's not only an EU member, but it's a NATO member. And, not only do you have just a separate quick thing, you have NATO looking at anti-democratic moves by Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. Then you have Orban, who has made all kinds of efforts to neuter the courts. He's now had passed through the parliament in recent days, essentially his rule by decree. There are efforts underway in the European Parliament in Brussels to have his party, the Fidesz party, I think that's the way you say it, kicked out of the European Parliament. This is, the next door to Hungary, or just to the northwest, is Belarus, and oftentimes Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, is referred to as Europe's last dictator. Well, Europe might get another one here pretty soon. It's a very concerning situation. His deeply nativist, deeply populist rule, his revanchist, sometimes flirting with anti-Semitism, often flirting with anti-Islamic statements, his absolute refusal to absorb any of the refugees that came in 2015 during the huge outpouring from the Syrian war when the Russians got involved there. This is where the mechanisms of the European Union are kind of exposed. It's a union largely based on collective progress towards no more war on the continent and economic stability. The mechanisms for enforcing democratic ideals, there are far better, more knowledgeable people on the mechanisms of the EU out there than I, but they don't seem to be that strong right now.
I mean, and you have an enormously indebted EU member, a massive economy in Italy being a ground zero for this coronavirus. Spain, it's still seeing its death count accelerate. And, we're all trying to get our heads around the various secondary, tertiary ripples of this pandemic. I mean, to say nothing of the debt crisis that was, the debts of these various economies were mutualized in 2012 and 2013. I mean, Germany is on the hook. Germany and France, to a certain extent, are on the hook for the fiscal health, the monetary health of the entire subcontinent.
Yeah, and in 2012 and 2013 was when I was reporting on an economic crisis in Europe. The Greeks were just outraged at the Germans. I mean, there were posters in the streets of Athens of Angela Merkel dressed as a Nazi because the German banks were so over-leveraged with Greek debt that she was just putting the screws to the Greeks. But now what you see coming forward is, yes, you have highly indebted countries. Italy's got one of the highest debt to GDP ratios of any country on the planet because largely people don't pay their taxes. Now struggling under this virus that has broken one of the premier health systems in Western Europe. Also under, and as Italy has had, 60 governments in the last 50 years, they now have a more moderate government, but they had a quite revanchist government in power up until recently that went foursquare against refugee and admitting refugees and asylum seekers. And now you have this enormous calamity on their hands that is, as the global economy was starting to cool, as we saw Chinese growth dip below 6%, and you saw a general sort of cycling down of the economy. The U.S. economy was going great guns, but a lot of others were starting to slow down. This is, disaster upon disaster. You can end up, they've got well over 10,000 dead in Italy. They've got over 10,000 dead in Spain, also a country that's, economically fragile at the moment. And where the chips fall on this crisis, I don't think anyone has a good handle on. I do think that you're looking at years and years of misery in a lot of sectors and a lot of countries and a lot of dead people after this is all said and done.
Morgan, do you buy the bookkeeping from Beijing? I mean, this country ascended to the World Trade Organization back in 2001, and it's just been gangbusters growth for the most part since. They've never truly felt a hard landing, even coming after 2007, 2008. You saw that infamous stat of all the concrete that they used in 3 years following the financial crisis was more than the United States used in the entire 20th century. Something doesn't smell right I mean, for the country that was the starting point of this pandemic, having to shut down all these cities of 10, 11, 12, 15 million people, suddenly expressing that they see economic green shoots?
There has always been concern about the opacity of China in every respect, in many respects, both its governance, its human rights record, its economic numbers. They hold so much American Treasury debt. There's the old saying: if I owe someone $100, they own me. If I owe them $1 million, I own them. So there's an interdependence between the U.S. and Chinese economies that the Trump administration, has been trying, as you well know, through tariff policy and trade war and all these other things, to try to sort of break a lot of linkages there. But there are a lot of people who don't trust the numbers out of China on their economic growth and other things, and that they've cooked the books not only possibly on COVID-19, but on their economic numbers for a long time. It is a concern, especially as there's a school of thought that says that the Chinese looked at 2008 and said the United States almost failed. The global financial system backed by the United States almost collapsed, and they looked at that moment as a moment to make their move. And they've been strengthening themselves economically. They've been much more aggressive on foreign policy. They have a expeditionary foreign policy, expeditionary economic policy in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, just this $1 trillion immense project to build ports and railways all throughout Asia, Southeast Asia. They own ports in Italy. They are, building railways in Ethiopia at these often usurious terms, whereby if people don't pay up, there's already
they take the resources.
They own whatever they've built. This has already happened in Sri Lanka. So there is.
But you are seeing the flip side of this is that there are Chinese people splayed across the developing world. If you go in sub-Saharan Africa, again, you're talking about northern Italy, you're talking about Iran, the Tehran subway system, and that's where maybe kind of tracing the path of this pandemic tells us that the pitfalls, the pratfalls of the globalized flat world.
Indeed.
Morgan, in the few minutes we have left, I'd like to take you to where it's typically been all quiet. I know you're a huge New York Yankees fan, and our beloved Manhattan, I lived there for a decade, is now the U.S. ground zero for this shocking pandemic. You're talking about overflowing emergency rooms, people holed up in their small studios and the like. I wonder how this is being perceived at the otherwise ho-hum U.S.-Canada border. I'm thinking about that gorgeous bridge on the, by Love Canal, Niagara Falls. And I'm even, all these states in New England suddenly worried about New Yorkers branching out and finding Airbnbs and summer homes. Is this going to cause necessarily, definitionally, some sort of border crisis between the United States and Canada?
I don't know that we're there yet, simply because U.S.-Canada trade is they're our largest trading partner. The United States' largest trading partner. And comparatively, Canada's population is less than 1/10 of the United States. There are significant border crossings every day for work, but the Canadians have their own outbreak. The Prime Minister's wife was diagnosed with COVID-19. The Prime Minister himself was in quarantine, Justin Trudeau. It doesn't strike me that it will lead to that kind of thing, but there was talk of the president militarizing the border, which would be a shocking break with tradition. It's the largest non-militarized border in the world. It doesn't occur to me that it's gotten to the point now. God knows what's going to happen.
Well, why shouldn't it be there? Washington State is an epicenter of this. People travel freely between Seattle and Vancouver. You think about Detroit and Windsor, Canada. You think about all the people who go partying in Montreal or Toronto who day trip it from Manhattan or from Albany.
That's not to say that there aren't more significant border checks and border controls. What I'm saying is that it doesn't seem to me to be a border crisis. As if you said, there's on the southern border, it's a different matter. You've seen the meme where Mexicans on social media were saying maybe we should pay for the wall to build it so Americans can't come south because they've got all the COVID-19.
Well, you saw those spring breakers. What were they in Texas that crossed the border and then brought it back 25 cases at a time. It definitely turns the prevailing wisdom of just 2-3 months ago on its head.
Yeah, it does. I think one of the things I keep thinking about is how this shakes out in American society itself. We are this, proverbial melting pot, and a riven one at that right now. But how does this shake out for the long term? You referenced earlier the governor of Rhode Island saying they wanted to turn back people with New York plates. The governor of Florida, who's been extraordinarily late to institute stay-at-home orders, wouldn't even close the beaches in many parts of the state until, and I don't believe he still has.
Well, Florida is its own country, of course. But go ahead.
It's its own planet. Whether or not you can... you see the numbers of New Yorkers already in Florida with their cars hauled down from New York to, the winter snowbirds who are down there. It's notions that you can stop people at the border because of their license plates is not something I've ever heard of. And you see this play out in the byplay among the states over resources, bidding against each other for ventilators, for personal protection equipment, for scarce resources that everyone is scrambling for on a global scale, going overseas and looking for them. It sparked a real kind of Hobbesian element in and among the states that is, it's happened so quickly that it's jarring to see. And I think how this plays out over the next years and frankly decade is going to be, simultaneously fascinating, but also kind of heart-wrenching to see.
Quickly, Morgan, who do you lament that we have short-shrifted, that we're not paying enough attention to across this massive but tiny planet?
I really think people need to pay more attention to refugees and underdeveloped countries. As I've mentioned a couple times, those populations, there were more people on the move than at any time since World War II. More people displaced by war, conflict, economic calamity, on the order of 70 million people. The organizations that are trying to house and feed and care for them are chronically underfunded. You saw the director of the World Food Program, the former South Carolina Governor David Beasley had contracted COVID-19. These groups are doing astonishing work in appalling conditions, and God forbid that this virus gets into those populations, because it will run rampant and go right through them, because there are no facilities to care for those people. And then, we spoke with the UN Secretary General, Judy Woodruff, on the NewsHour last Friday, and he said his great nightmare is that this gets into the underdeveloped nations of sub-Saharan Africa, because there are hundreds of millions of people in countries that are many of them fragile on a good day, and that is what concerns me. There was a report just out today about indigenous populations in Brazil where a woman had contracted it. There are hundreds of indigenous tribes that Bolsonaro, who can frankly, wend his way into overtly racist rhetoric sometimes, has made his job to try to take some of their forest away to give to agrarian interests and cattle interests and other things. It goes into those populations of people who live in deep in the jungle and have no medical facilities. You're looking at, just an awful calamity.
Morgan Till, senior producer for Foreign Affairs at the PBS NewsHour, which I think is the best thing going on TV news, bar none. I'm conflicted. I've done a couple of pieces for you guys, but you are always welcome on this show. And God willing, on the other end of this, I will treat you to a sumptuous Persian dinner up in Northern Virginia.
Indeed, I look forward to it.
Thank you. Full disclosure, our engineer is John Valentine. This show airs on NPR member station VPM News, on the NPR One app, which I cannot live without. It is so clutch, especially right now. And on Apple Podcasts at link fulldradio.com. Please subscribe. I'm Robin Farzad. Hang in there. Back with you next week.